Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Ada Sue Hinshaw, the co-editor of Magnet Hospitals Revisited, Attraction and Retention of Professional Nurses. Welcome to Rip Rap, Dr. Hinshaw.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have you because while this title looks somewhat formal, it deals with a central problem, and that is the challenge of getting enough nurses for the healthcare industry. And there is this concept about, well, first we ought to talk about the magnitude of the problem now.
Magnitude of the shortage of nurses.
Right.
It is severe, it's pervasive, and it's unlike any that we've seen in the last several decades. So it's disconcerting for all of us at this point as to what we will need to do to be able to turn around this shortage. I think when you look at it, you can tell that when you look at your newspapers that there are a number of advertisements every weekend for nurses and all kinds of monetary incentives that are being offered to draw nurses into different hospitals. But it's not just hospitals, it's also community agencies. It's always been a shortage in nursing homes, home care, assisted living, etc. So we've got a pervasive problem that's going to take some time to be able to turn it around. At this point, we look like we're a couple of 100,000 vacancies in the country if we look just at acute care. But that is nothing to what we will look like by 2020. If we don't turn this around, by 2020 we are expected to have close to 1 million vacancies in terms of nurses. There are only 2.2 million in the country right now, so you can see the magnitude of that difficulty.
Well, your book talks about how there was a shortage in the early 1980s and how they came up with this idea of magnet hospitals. But there's a considerable difference between that shortage and this one from what you said. There
is, for several reasons. First of all, there looks like we have two back-to-back shortages right now. We are in what we would think of as a short-term time and problem. But as, frankly, the economy goes south in this country and more nurses who have been working part-time decide to work full-time, we will be able to turn around this particular shortage, but only for about 2 or 3 years. After that, at the end of this decade, nurses will begin to retire from their profession because of the average age. We are an older professional group, and that will mean that we will be retiring at a much faster age than we have had people coming in to the schools of nursing or into the pipeline to replace us.
So as the book says, this is a much more severe situation than what was the earlier one.
Much more severe. One of the major difficulties is the image of nursing, and that comes from the kind of work environment that we have been in for a number of years. So quite frankly, this is our opportunity with the shortage as a pressure point to be able to try and renegotiate that work environment and renegotiate the image. People see from the newspapers, people see nurses as being stressed, overworked, understaffed, out of control of their personal lives because they have to work when they're told to work. That is not a kind of image that is going to draw young people into a profession. So changing that is really important.
Well, the other thing that fascinated me is you've talked, and we'll have to go into the concept of the magnet hospital, but there's also a whole larger point here about what would be attractive to an employee, to, you know, what would make a good working environment and draw them to it. But maybe we can talk a little first about the magnet hospital concept.
Well, magnet hospital is a concept that came about in the early 1980s when we were in the middle of another shortage. We've been having these cycles of shortages since about 1940. But in the early 1980s, we again began to look at why is it that we are in a cycle? Why are we short of nurses? Why do nurses leave hospitals? And all at once, a group that had been appointed by the American Academy of Nursing decided to take a fresh look at this. And they said, wait a minute. Instead of always asking the negative question, why are people leaving and not staying, let's look at those hospitals that we know do very well, regardless of the shortage. They're able to attract and they're able to thus the term magnet hospital because of that retention, that attraction and retention factor in that sense. So that is when, as a task force, they began the first series of studies around what is a magnet hospital and what constitutes really good work conditions.
Well, why don't we go through some of the specifics, because I found it fascinating, actually. For example, the idea of enlightened administration. Maybe you can explain some of these.
What is enlightened administration?
Yeah.
Well, Magnet Hospital essentially is a hospital in which nurses have control over their own practice, and that means that they set in decision-making tables and in a decision-making process at all levels of the organization, from the chief nurse executive, who is on the hospital board, to the staff nurse, who is sitting on the patient care committees with physicians and other health professionals to decide care plans for patients and to decide policies for patients. So control over practice is a big issue, not one that is in all hospitals. It means you have to have very competent nurses, and you have to have a lot of respect for those nurses. The enlightened administration is also having a chief nursing executive who is very visible, very vivacious, and has a clear view of what it means to build a professional nursing practice environment. And that means to literally decentralize the decision-making for patients to those nurses at the bedside who actually are working with the patient, rather than trying to dictate it from some other level in the hospital. Magnet Hospital also includes relationships with other health professionals, particularly physicians, that are positive and collaborative, and in which a nurse feels respected and a major member of the team. So it's not a hard concept to understand, and yet it's one that has not always guided and guides very few, in very few hospitals, the practice that actually occurs there.
So what would be the difference between a magnet hospital and, I guess we'd say, the ordinary hospital, or some of the current practices? The nurse would be just more involved with the, first of all, I think you're saying that there's an organizational difference, is that right?
Big organizational difference, yes. And that's where part of the enlightened administration comes in, because you have to have very strong support from hospital administration and the chief executive officer, as well as then having this very visible, very capable chief nurse officer who kind of sets the vision and sets the pace for that organization. In other organizations, you have nurses not involved in the patient care processes or in the decision-making processes. They're not on hospital boards, they're not on executive boards, they're not involved in the patient care committees or setting the policies for patient care on a particular unit. So they're simply coming to work, doing an 8-hour shift, going home, rather than the nurse who comes to work, feels like she knows that she's got a set of patients to care for. She knows that she can, in fact, tailor her care to that patient because she will have the support of the organization to do that. And she has enough support that she can also say, I need these resources to be able to care for this patient in a high-quality manner. And she can access those resources. In a hospital that's a not magnet hospital, very often it's policies and procedures for how many resources you can have and how much you can spend, etc. And nurses don't have access to that.
One of the other things I thought was interesting in your book is the global implications of the shortage and organization. Maybe you can speak to that, because I know you've been attending conferences around the world.
Yes, that's very true. We've just begun the studies, a colleague of mine at the University of Pennsylvania, to look at magnet hospitals and professional nursing practice models in about 5 different countries. But the shortage itself is very severe this time in the sense that it encompasses almost the entire worldwide nation, international countries. We've clearly got a difficulty. We used to be able to bring nurses from the Philippines, for example. And nurses in schools in the Philippines actually overtrain and have too many nurses deliberately because they supply the states with nurses. But at this point, they are short of nurses themselves, and many other countries that we would turn to are short of nurses. So then you get into this trouble of, even though we can outspend and buy those nurses and bring them here, is that an ethical thing to do? Because then we leave those countries extremely short. So it becomes a real difficulty as you balance that particular dilemma.
Well, and in this country, the demographics are changing, so there's more people who are going to be senior citizens, and so there's going to require more care. And it seems like also in what you're saying is that this is not just hospitals, but nursing homes and other kinds of extended care facilities where people are facing different disability issues.
Well, when you think that the largest growing population in this country is the over 85, and the next largest is the over 65 population. We are talking about nursing homes, assisted care, home care, community agencies. So we now have quite a spread of nurses. Part of the shortage difficulty is the demand situation. We have more nurses in this country today than we have ever had, but we have a greater demand. And so nurses are spread very thinly across all these various areas at this point.
We were talking just before the interview that, you know, technology is now becoming more and more an element of medical care, but you need people who can interpret that technology. You can have all the machines beeping there, but and that's one of the things that's always impressed me about well-qualified nurses is they have that expertise to help act as an interface.
Yeah, the nurse is really somebody who multitasks very well. They have to take the complexity of working with a human being, being worried about the relationship with that human being, working with that family to whom the individual belongs, also worrying about all of the technology and what that information tells you about what's happening with that individual, put all of that together and tailor what you're going to do for that patient. So there's not a prescription. There's not a way of being able to say, this is a formula, and so this is what I do. You have to take in all that information, make your judgments, and then tailor your interventions for that patient and their families.
Well, of course, you're the Dean of the Nursing School at the University of Michigan. And one of the questions as we were talking here that came to my mind is how has all this changed the strategies of the nursing school as you start taking a look at the changes in the environment and the demands on nurses?
Several things have occurred. First of all, from 1995 through to about 2001, we had almost a 25% drop in the enrollment of nurses across the country for schools of nursing. That's why the pipeline became so much smaller. So at that point, we started very strong recruitment and marketing programs for trying to portray an image both of nursing and of the school, which would want to make young people want to come into the school. And not just women, because we're still primarily women in nursing, but to appeal more and more to men and to be able to get men to enter nursing in the profession. So that's one thing, this big recruitment marketing kind of effort. We've also instituted a new undergraduate curriculum, which brings individuals in the freshman year directly into several nursing courses. And within the first year, by the time they go home for Christmas, they have had an experience going into the community to do a service learning project, learning how to work with people in that community and beginning to form relationships and knowing how to be a partner with the people they work with in the community. So very early, they're into understanding social behaviors, community kinds of values, and how to interact with that.
It seems also that there's the development of the concept of nurse practitioner and, you know, additional demands.
Yes, our graduate programs now, we have a large number of the nurse practitioner programs. We have about 7 or 8 programs that are offered, so it's a wide variety. That is about a 2.5 year program. Depending, for a certified nurse midwife, you're about 2.5 years instead of 2. But these individuals then have put together the nursing philosophy of relationships, social values, families, holistic care with clinical management of certain routine kinds of disease conditions. It's a nice combination, and those people are very much in demand.
Well, I've been pretty impressed from the people I've met who do it. I mean, they have a whole different dimension to what they're doing with the nursing, you know, a whole additional level of expertise.
Then you can move from that into the doctoral programs. So now there are a number of doctoral programs in nursing. These are individuals who, like in any other university unit, are very involved in research, but also in teaching and do some practice. And then, of course, there's the postdoc studies. So in nursing now you have a wide array of opportunities.
The other thing that impressed me about the book is that there was quite considered research about this magnet hospital concept and following out. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
No, I'd be glad to. It's been fun to watch that whole body of research develop over the past 2 decades. In the early 1980s, the original study literally defined through reputational methods, and then looked at turnover data and vacancy data to define the magnet hospitals in the country. And finally ended up studying in depth 41 of those hospitals. They had a great deal of qualitative data, and they came through with about 14 different factors that would be considered essentials of magnetism, which is what they're called today. But then, following that, there have been two major research teams in the country, one at University of Pennsylvania, the other one at University of Nevada, who have followed up on this and really studied the magnet characteristics much more carefully. There's one team, Kramer and Schmallenberg, who have looked at staff nurses almost exclusively, following staff nurses to see what is important to them about a work environment and what makes for a magnet hospital. And then there is a second team at the University of Pennsylvania who have looked more carefully at, given those characteristics or elements of magnetism, then how does that relate to patient and nurse outcomes? What difference does it make that you have a magnet hospital with certain characteristics?
The other thing is, I think our viewers should know, is that you also have had some important positions in professional nursing associations, and that also gives some additional dimension to what you're talking about.
Yes, I've been very much involved with a lot of this research. My own research background is in job satisfaction, job stress, and anticipated turnover for staff nurses. Through the last several decades, my research was in that area. I've also had the opportunity to be the president for the American Academy of Nursing, and so I've been following closely this new book and what we'll be able to do with that in terms of making a difference with particularly hospital administrators, community administrators, those kinds of positional people.
Well, and in the book you say that this magnet hospital concept may be one of the most important things that association may help happen.
We truly think that it may have been. It's the one single successful type of professional nursing practice model that has literally been in existence for over 2 decades. And the more data we have about it, the stronger it looks. And we think that it will give us the opportunity to really change the image of nursing. Because if we can change the work environment and nurses really enjoy what they do, they feel good about the quality of care they can give, they understand their competence is used at the very highest level. That's a very different image of the professional nurse. And that will get people interested in coming in. I always think of that Johnson & Johnson commercial that you've seen sometimes around Olympic time that says "Dare to Care," and it's about nursing. And that's essentially what it is, dare to care. And in the right environment, you really can do that. Yeah.
Well, and in this era of paying attention to how much things cost, one of the things, the issues you brought up was cost-benefit, studies about how well this works.
Well, we know that there are several kinds of outcomes for magnet hospitals. And one of the outcomes is for the organizations themselves. They find that they are able to attract nurses, far less money in marketing. They are able to retain nurses. And when you think of the fact that a regular staff nurse costs about $48,000 to replace, and a critical care nurse costs $64,000 to replace, those turnover factors, if they can cut in half their turnover rate, really makes a big difference for a hospital very quickly, an organization very quickly. There's also a shorter length of stay, so they're saving money with the shorter length of stay. There are fewer days in the critical care unit. There's less morbidity and mortality, so there's less legal insurance and malpractice problems. So we really need to do the research to understand what's the cost benefit here, because there's a lot of benefit to the organization itself.
Well, that's what I was trying to indicate earlier when I said it looks kind of like a win-win thing that could also be helpful in other work environments, is when you're dealing with employees and working with them on what their needs are and providing them, then you get into a situation that everyone benefits from it. What's the projection, do you think, for this concept? Do you think it's going to really take off, or as you try to meet the nursing needs?
I think that it will, and there's some data to substantiate that. We have the American Nurses Association that has established a credentialing center through which hospitals can apply to become magnet hospitals. It's a lengthy process, 4 stages, takes a certain amount of investment, and they have to meet the standards to be one of these hospitals, having the kinds of characteristics that we've talked about. And that's relatively expensive to have all of that in place. We have gone from the early 1990s, when that was started, with about 7 hospitals who applied and were granted magnet hospital status, to late in almost year 2000, they began all at once with the nursing shortage to really pay attention to this concept. So that hospitals began to apply, and today we have over 65 of those that are now credentialed. And they are frankly looking for a lot more that will be applying at this point.
What's involved in the credentialing process? I mean, it's fascinating
Yeah.
to me, because it would seem any good system you would have to have adequate preparation. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's literally the 14 essentials of magnetism that are involved. So it's everything from the way that you structure your hospital, to how your nurses are structured, to how they are able to take part in the decision making, to the fact that they have adequate staff so that they can in fact have particular patient-nurse ratios, through to having the kinds of team collaboration mechanisms in place which breeds good relationships with physicians and other health professionals. All of that is a part of putting yourself in position to be able to be credentialed as a magnet hospital.
And how long does this take to accomplish?
Most agencies, most hospitals, about 2 years from the time you apply.
But this also going to apply to other medical care facilities like nursing homes?
Yes. They've just begun to apply it to nursing homes. We don't have as much data on the nursing homes yet, so we still have some research work to do in that area. But they're now talking about magnet home care units, magnet assisted living areas. It would really apply to almost any kind of agency where you can provide this kind of professional, collaborative, able to use your competencies kind of environment. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's a wonderful idea, and certainly in this era where I've seen some pretty aggressive marketing to recruit nurses. It seems like there's all kinds of offers, you know, if you come to our hospital, we'll do this and that. You know, but it is certainly of increasing concern as we're facing the demographic changes and other, you know, elements.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said earlier, people just living longer, so we've got to find a way to deal with that.
Mm.
Well, I found it a very interesting book, and it's available through the Nursing Association, the American Nurses Publishers.
That's correct.
So we'll put that on as part of, at the end of this
cool.
program, so people can be encouraged to buy it. I think
Excellent.
it may be interesting, actually, anybody who's spent some time in a hospital may be interested to see how the nurses are trying to get organized to deal with their side of the care package.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for being on Rip Rap.
My pleasure. Thank you. Yeah.